welcome to the Books and Music Review Show. And we have Gerard today, and we have two wonderful books. Over to you, Gerard.
Thank you. So today we'll be discussing two books, one of which is entitled The Greatest Stories Never Told, 100 Tales to Astonish, Bewilder, and Stupefy. And as you can see from the cover, it describes all sorts of kind of strange and interesting stories from history involving archaeology, chemistry, art, music, and politics. Just every spectrum of life. It's published by MJF. Both of these books were published by MJF, but this is a History Channel book. So it focuses on different little vignettes from global history, the history of the world, and they're all really fascinating. Some of them are kind of funny. For example, there's one which describes the origin of the croissant. Contrary to popular belief, the croissant isn't really a French delicacy. It's not a French pastry. It was invented in Austria, and the author describes how it was inadvertently invented during the late 17th century. The Ottoman Empire decided to invade Central Europe, and they had been conquering huge parts of the southern Europe and making forays into Central Europe, into Austria and Hungary for centuries. So in 1683, they sent 100,000 troops and laid siege to Vienna and besieged the city. And the inhabitants had destroyed the walls outside of their city to prepare a clear field of fire against the invading troops. They had heard stories about all of the towns in their country and in other neighboring countries that had been destroyed, even though they had surrendered to the Turks. So they were on the verge of being overrun through a series of underground tunnels and subterranean tunnels that were being dug in order to capture the city from within, in order to defeat all of the fortifications. And they were alerted to the armies inside were alerted to this by Austrian bakers, and were able to use that information in order to thwart the Turkish invasion and delay the advance long enough for Jan Sobieski, a Polish general, to come to their rescue. And in order to celebrate this victory, the bakers supposedly they had seen the crescent on the Turkish flags as they were retreating, and they created this pastry called a kipfel, or crescent, which later on it would be adopted when an Austrian princess, Marie Antoinette, who would be the future queen of France, married to Louis XVI, when she visited, it was dubbed a croissant. So Parisian bakers baked it in tribute to her, but it was actually an Austrian pastry. So that's just one of the stories. There are a whole host of others. For example, there's one which describes a meeting where President Theodore Roosevelt in 1905 he convened all of the main figures in college football, which back then was the primary form of entertainment for people who watched football. There weren't really professional leagues. The best football stars were players for Harvard and Yale and Columbia. And Theodore Roosevelt decided to convene a meeting in 1905 in order to address a growing problem, which was that people were being killed on the field, killed and maimed and horribly injured. It's kind of it kind of evokes images of the game today, where you have people wondering whether or not football should be banned. That was one of the main questions on the table. The TR, who also had a son who was a football player, gave them an ultimatum to make the game more suitable, more manageable on the bodies of the players. Because during the 19th and early part of the century, you had a really violent, even more violent in some ways, game than you have today. You had flying wedges, a military formation where players would run down the field at full speed in a V-shaped formation and crash into the other team. You had clotheslines and all sorts of... Essentially, there were no rules up into the late part of the century and early part of the 20th century. And one of the people who was responsible for making the game safer was President Roosevelt, by adopting certain rules such as penalties for unnecessary roughness. There were no penalties for unnecessary roughness at this point. You could just basically just destroy someone on the field, like Ndamukong Suh, or one of these players that goes wild after the play and attacks another player, or Rob Gronkowski. And he was able to prevent, essentially prevent the game from being abolished, because there were over 100 deaths or so in the history of football up until that point. And I think in that year there were somewhere on the order of 19 or 20 players who died. And it comes back full circle to today, where you have a real concern because of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which a West African doctor, Bennett Amalu, was able to diagnose in players. He opened the brain of a center for the New York Steelers during the 1970s, Mike Webster, and diagnosed him with this disease among many other diseases. And he wasn't even familiar with American football, but this discovery led to a concussion protocol and an investigation into why so many football players had developed long-term brain injuries, brain damage, and all of the effects of those diseases that playing decades in the NFL had caused. There are a couple of other interesting stories in the book. A lot of interesting stories. Another good one is the actress Hedy Lamarr, who is kind of this amazing woman who's not only an acclaimed, beautiful actress, but also a scientist, which she didn't receive recognition for when she was at the time. But eventually, she came to be known as the woman who helped, at least a co-inventor of technology that would be used in cell phones and satellite encryption. She has a really amazing story. She was married to an Austrian. She was married to an Austrian arms merchant who was also a Nazi sympathizer and a very abusive man, whom she escaped from by supposedly drugging her maid, and escaping through a window, and fleeing Austria and settling in the United States, and of course becoming a movie star. But during the beginning of World War II, her and a music composer, George Antheil, developed a radio guidance system that prevented torpedoes from being jammed, and it used something called frequency hopping, which is the basic idea is the radio signals switch frequency in order to make interception of these torpedoes impossible. Of course, she wasn't able to capitalize on it, but it was during her lifetime because the patent had expired. But she was eventually it was adopted by the U.S. Navy, and it was first used during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, now it's a technology that fueled just numerous inventions that have made it possible to communicate across the globe. And it's really amazing when you think of what she was able to accomplish that no one really acknowledged at the time. And I'd just like to talk about one final story from this book, which was the Thanksgiving Day holiday. Thanksgiving was a couple of weeks ago, of course, and it's on the same day every year. But Franklin Roosevelt wanted to change the day in 1939. Of course, this was during the Great Depression, and this was actually a few years after this. The Great Depression had another recession had come along, and businesses were really desperate to boost their sales. So he scheduled it for the last day. It was scheduled for the last day of November, and these businesses lobbied him to move it up a week in order to boost the economy. And that's what he did. He not only moved it up a week, he said that it would be the following year it would also be on the same day, which created a huge outcry. You had editorial cartoonists lampooning him, editorials attacking him for what would seem to be really kind of capricious decision. You need to remember, this was after he'd already purportedly violated all of the typical norms for a president at the time in terms of seeming to want more power and to arrogate more power to himself. So it was a huge controversy, and the country was really divided over this. Half of the states decided to keep the Thanksgiving holiday the same day, and the other half celebrated it on the new day. And Texas and Colorado decided to celebrate it on both days. So it was a bit of a debacle. And it's funny, in the book, there's a little blurb which explains that he actually wanted to move it to Monday, but his staff dissuaded him from doing that when they realized that religious leaders would really object to that idea. So the other book I'd like to discuss just briefly is 100 Things You're Not Supposed to Know. This is the front of the book. I'll show you the title. It's also by MJF, and the stories are a little more serious than in the first book. At least there's less humor used to tell these anecdotes, which are also a lot of them do involve history. Some of them are descriptions of contemporary issues that are undercovered or not really explored by the media. Some of them are topics that people know about, but that don't get a lot of coverage. For example, one of them is eminent domain, the process where the government is allowed to seize your property, ostensibly in the pursuit of a public good. And the Fifth Amendment covers this issue. It's enshrined in the Fifth Amendment's takings clause, which delineates when the government can take your property in pursuit of can seize private property on behalf of the public good. And when people think about this, they usually consider projects like building highways or schools, things that are done in order to benefit the broader community. They don't usually consider it a public good when a corporation, when the land is seized in order for a corporation to build something like a private business. But increasingly, that's what happens. And this book was written, I think it was published in 2005, and they cite a study that was done in 2003 by the Institute for Justice, which is a libertarian think tank, and they focus a lot on this issue. And they did a study which described over 10,000 cases in over 41 states over the course of 4 years, where the government seized land, private land, so a home or or a private business in order to benefit a corporation. And the rationale is usually that the land itself is economically depressed or blighted, and that by destroying or seizing these properties, they're actually increasing the economic the tax base that then can be used to provide for the community at large. And a great, a really pivotal case in this respect actually occurred after this study, and involved the city of New London in Connecticut, which seized a group of homes that belonged to private citizens in order to fund an economic redevelopment project that never actually occurred. But the case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, Kelo versus Connecticut, and the ruling, the 5-4 decision, which relied on previous Supreme Court decisions, essentially declared that the city was within its rights to condemn these properties, and seize the homes of these individuals, including the lead plaintiff, Suzette Kelo, because essentially it was constitutional. It was within the Constitution. And the critics of this decision allege that no, it was a vast overreach of the Constitution. The idea that condemned property could be used for any kind of nebulous purpose rather than specifically for public good. The idea that you can just seize the property and build a strip mall or a huge business and then claim it's on behalf of the community. Another good example of the abuse of this power of eminent domain occurred in Brooklyn during the Atlantic Yards project, where Forest City Ratner Corporation from Ohio was able to get the city was able to get New York to help them build a gigantic sports arena, which was the keystone of the project, and a huge 34-story building in order to boost their business. But it was framed as an economic revitalization of downtown Brooklyn. But as a result, Prospect Heights, the neighborhood, was drastically altered, and resulted in this multi-year-long, almost a decade-long battle of individual renters and apartment owners and a gigantic corporation in the city that wanted them to leave their premises. And eventually they lost the case, but it was a good example of the abuses that eminent domain can be put to, the exploitation that can be involved in this. And there are a lot of interesting scientific stories in this book as well. For example, there's a page about a couple of pages about the dangers of smoking, the examined dangers. A lot of people know that smoking causes things like lung cancer and cancer of the throat or lip, especially if tobacco causes these diseases, especially if you chew tobacco or you're a cigar smoker. But people don't realize how much of the body is how many different diseases are caused by tobacco and smoking. And this book cites a study by the American Council on Science and Health, which actually they published a book called "Cigarettes: What the Warning Label Doesn't Tell You," which referenced over 450 articles from medical journals, which examined the dangers of smoking, to not just dangers that people are aware of, but the kind of holistic problems that occur when someone smokes. For example, it causes kidney and bladder and pancreatic cancer, but it also affects your circulatory system, peripheral vascular disease, which dulls your senses in your limbs and can lead to paralysis eventually. It causes that. In over 3/4 of the cases, it's more dangerous in that respect than, in some ways, it's more dangerous than diabetes, because it cuts off the circulation to your limbs, and the blood flow, and really just damages you. It damages your circulatory system.
3 minutes.
And there are all sorts of other things that people might not be aware of. The fact that it causes psoriasis. I mean, people know that smoking causes you to age prematurely in some respects, but they might not be aware of the fact that smokers need more anesthesia for surgery. They recover from wounds more slowly than non-smokers, and just a lot of there are a lot of things, just dozens upon dozens of different things that decrease your quality of life if you start smoking. And there are a lot of interesting stories like that in this book. Like I said, it's a bit more, I guess a bit less whimsical. It's not as funny as the other book, but they're both worth reading in different respects. Like the title is 100 Things You're Not Supposed to Know. It's by Russ Kick. And the other book is titled The Greatest Stories Never Told: 100 Tales from History to Stupefy, to Astonish, Bewilder, and Stupefy. And if you're a big fan of history or science or art or culture in general, I'd recommend both of them. Just check them out at your library, or if you can find them in your local bookstore or Barnes & Noble. They're definitely worth perusing. So this is the end of the show. We're almost out of time. And I'd just like to thank you for listening and watching at home. And hopefully we'll see you very soon. Thank you.